Now we're going to talk about a few more non-Mendelian inheritance patterns, or ways that our genes work to create a specific phenotype beyond what Mendel understood. And I'm going to start with the concept called epistasis. Now, the example I'm giving you is a case of epistasis where certain alleles in one gene affect the expression of another gene, which in this example determines how much of a specific protein is produced. Epistasis can go beyond this. There can be genes where certain alleles will turn off other genes and make it look like the individual has a recessive allele instead of a dominant allele, which is what they really have. So when we mentioned incomplete dominance, sometimes it's epistasis. The environment can also impact gene expression, and sometimes that gets lumped under this category. But let's just look at the simple form of epistasis. And Labrador retrievers are a fantastic example of this. Labrador retrievers come in 4 basic colors: a very pale yellow, yellow labs, chocolate labs, and black labs. And there are 2 genes involved here, one of which determines the type of pigment in the fur. Is it the light colored pigment, which shows up as kind of yellow, or the dark pigment, which can show up as black or brown? So the dark pigment is dominant over the light colored pigment. So if a Labrador has the dark pigment allele, they're going to be either chocolate or black. If they are homozygous for the recessive allele, 2 copies of the recessive allele, they're going to be either very pale yellow or yellow, kind of on the golden end of yellow. When we look at the dark labs, the difference between a chocolate lab and a black lab depends on a second gene. And that gene has 2 alleles that determine how much pigment is made. The dominant form makes the most pigment. 2 copies of the recessive and you make less pigment. So if you've got the dark pigment and a lot of it, you're a black lab. Dark pigment, not as much, chocolate lab. Light colored pigment, well, you're a yellow lab either way. I'm not sure why breeders don't lump these into 2 categories. If you make a lot of the light colored pigment, you're kind of a more golden colored lab. And if you make very little, you're a pale yellow lab. And that's the simple explanation of epistasis, which is as much as we're going to get into this one, because it can get really complicated really quickly. But it's very important, and it's a major factor in genetics, in humans especially. You may have heard of this, X-linked inheritance. So there are around 800 genes on the X chromosome. Humans cannot live without at least 1 copy of the X chromosome. There's just no way around it. These genes are not the same genes as on the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome has many, many fewer genes. And I realized that I said 800 on the X chromosome and the image here says 900 to 1600. I'm pretty sure my data is more up to date than whoever made this graphic. But it doesn't matter. There's a lot more genes on the X chromosome than the Y chromosome. That's the important part. That, and you have to have an X chromosome. So when you are looking at inheritance patterns, it looks different if the genes are on the X chromosome compared to those other chromosomes that we call the autosomal chromosomes, the ones that are numbered 1 through 22. All humans get one X chromosome inherited from the mother. For genetic females and XXY males, they can also get an X chromosome from the father. XXY males can also get 2 X's from the mom. It's once you get more than 2 copies of a chromosome, then things can be, there's a lot more diversity there. If one of the genes here is solely responsible for a phenotype, that phenotype will show up more often, that allele will show up more often in males than in females. Females will have at least 2 copies of each gene on the X chromosome. Males, if they're XY males, will only have 1 copy of the X chromosome. So if there's a disorder or something on the X chromosome, you're going to see it in males more than females. So the most common so-called disorder linked to the X chromosome is red-green color blindness. So human vision, we have 3 different color receptors. They're called blue, red, and green sensitive. The alleles for pigments in the red and green receptors are both on the X chromosome. If there is a mutation in one of these 2 genes that makes it so the person cannot make the right pigments for the red sensitive receptor or the green sensitive receptor, they cannot distinguish between red and green, and they are called red-green colorblind. Approximately 8% of men with white Northern European ancestry have red-green color blindness. If you look at women, it's about 0.5% with the same ancestry. And there are lots of other kinds of color blindness that are not X-linked. And you can see there are several different genetic conditions, including a form of muscular dystrophy, some immune system dysfunctions, a type of hemophilia that can all be found on the X chromosome. And all of these are going to be much more common in males than in females. Nowadays, there are glasses for colorblind correction. They only work for some kinds of color blindness. I'm pretty sure red-green it's the most common form, and I'm pretty sure the colorblind correction sunglasses or glasses work for that type of color vision. The image on the left-hand side is so-called normal vision. The right-hand side is what red-green color blindness looks like. If they look the same to you, I'm sorry. See if you can borrow a pair of those glasses. They're not cheap. Then there are genes in the mitochondria. Wait, what? There are genes that aren't in the nucleus? Damn, Skippy. Yes, there are genes in the mitochondria. Humans inherit our mitochondria from our mother. There are mitochondria in sperm, but when there's fertilization, those mitochondria don't get into the egg, just the nuclear DNA. Genes in the mitochondria, they're pretty much involved in energy metabolism. And there can be pretty common mutations. They're more common in the mitochondria than what you see in the nuclear DNA, which is okay because an individual cell is going to have a lot of mitochondria, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of mitochondria. So your mitochondria, even within one cell, can be different genetically. It can be really, really hard to figure out if a genetic condition is caused by a mutation on the mitochondrial gene, because it's very rare for all the mitochondria in a cell or in a person to have that same harmful mutation. But we do know that if there's a problem in the mitochondria, if the mitochondria don't work correctly, the person will show neurological problems, frequently deafness, blindness, impaired growth in children, and decreased muscle mass because they are not able to produce enough ATP or cellular energy. Now, the genetic mutations that lead to this are usually in the nuclear DNA, the stuff we've been talking about all the time. I wanted to mention one other thing here. It's not really an inheritance pattern. It's a concept. Most human traits are what we call multifactorial. If you break that word down and look at it, multi, many, lots, factor. In this case, it's an influence. So multifactorial means that genes and the environment both contribute to the phenotype. Some phenotypes are more dependent on genes, some are more dependent on the environment. So my example here, no matter how much time I spend in a tanning bed or laying out during the summer, I am never going to have gorgeous mahogany skin. There's a limit to how dark my skin will get. My skin will get darker with sun exposure, but just to a limit. So there's a limit on it. Height, I mentioned smoking effect on height. Well, people who are exposed to cigarette smoke as children are often up to an inch shorter as adults than they would have been if they hadn't been exposed to cigarettes. 1 inch, that's only a little bit when you think about the entire amount of height for the average person. Some phenotypes are much more dependent on the environment. High blood pressure, exercise and weight loss will lower that. Diabetes type 2, lack of exercise, being obese contribute significantly to type 2 diabetes. It's not the only thing. And it doesn't have an effect on type 1 diabetes. But there's a genetic component and there's a big environmental component there. It's not nature versus nurture. It's nature and nurture.